1944. Casino, Italy. Rain hammers the canvas roof. A single carbide lamp throws a hard circle of light over a metal table. Boots squelch in the mud outside. The air tastes of antiseptic and wet wool. A stretcher thuds, bandage rolls tumble. A silver pocket watch slips from an officer's torn coat and clatters on the tray, lid snapping open with a tiny, bright ping. The lamp catches an old engraving. The watch face stares back like a small, calm accusation. He's the enemy. He's a patient. We barely have time for either. Edward's gloved hand closes on the cold watch, the scalpel already raised above the chest as the distant guns chew the night and the choice. And the world narrows to metal and breath. He smells wet leather and old tobacco, a memory like a sting. His thumb catches the tiny engraving. The initials blink under the lamp. An orderly shifts, boots whispering on canvas. The lamp gutters once. The scalpel trembles above the ribs as the watch keeps its steady, small, accusing tick. Mercy where hate was expected. A British surgeon in a rain-soaked field hospital, holding a German officer's pocket watch under the harsh light of the operating lamp. Outside, the guns keep time. Inside, Edward Collins must choose how to use the last of his morphine and the final hour of his strength, while a name inside the watch reminds him of a life from before the flags. If real stories of courage under oath in World War II move you, subscribe for more WW2 true stories. The tent stood on a ridge above a churned road. A British field hospital pressed forward with the front line. It was February, mud in every boot, and the monastery at Casino, a dark shape on the skyline. Edward Collins commanded a small surgical team, 2 orderlies, a nurse with a Red Cross armband, and 1 exhausted medic. Their job was simple and brutal: pull lives back from the edge, stitch what could be stitched, send the rest to the rear. Stretchers arrived in a steady, grim queue between shelling. Ambulances could not always reach them. Supplies were thin: 1 tray of morphine ampoules, a stack of bandage rolls, a single anesthetic bottle. Triage meant writing chances in shorthand. Who could wait? Who needed the lamp now? Triage is a method of sorting wounds by likelihood of survival, nothing more than a practical rule in a small space. The Geneva Convention already marked medical spaces with a cross. It said the wounded were to be treated, not killed. The medical oath hung in every sterile motion, a promise to aid the dying man whether he wore the same uniform or the enemy's. Orders came from colonels and from grief. Propaganda whispered that mercy was weakness. Oath over orders, mercy over propaganda. They hauled them in by the light of the lamp. A collapsed German officer rode on a litter between 2 prisoners. Mud crusted on their boots like old paint. An orderly peeled back a torn collar, and the pale throat showed a bandage soaked through. A makeshift dressing circled a shallow, worrying gap at the abdomen. The watch lay open on the tray, the little engraving of a cafe like a bright, out-of-place scrap. Someone muttered the patrol route. Another rasped for morphine. Prisoners from the last sweep. Officer among them. Looks bad. Bring him in here. Edward slid a hand under the shoulder, felt the slack of someone who might not wake again. He felt the metallic bite of the watch against his palm and the old conversation. Berlin rain, a shared joke about sutures from before the war, flashed like a photograph. For a moment, the room was only lamps and the sound of breath that might stop. He worked fast. Hands became a practiced choreography. Clamp, tie, hand off. The assistant held the lamp. The nurse tightened a tourniquet. The scalpel cut cleaner than the rain outside. He checked the pulse, counted a shallow rise and fall, rechecked the set of ribs. The medic passed a syringe. Morphine was measured, not spared. Anesthetic? Only a little left. Give him what keeps him still. The decision to give what little anesthetic remained was not a question of politics, but of pulse and chance. Each ampule used here meant one less for another stretcher outside. Edward thought of the list of names pinned to the ward, friends who would never see this field again. And then of the man whose name was stamped in cramped script inside a watch lid. They set priorities by the lamp's glare. He began to operate, moving through practiced motions so the memory did not have room to expand. His hands learned to shut the past into a small, dark box and work. The oath kept pace with every stitch, speaking in muscle memory. Treat the dying man. After the first sweep of suturing, an orderly pushed in a backboard with a young British corporal. He had a jagged gash along the thigh and a jaw clenched around pain like a kept promise. He needed blood. Edward judged him salvageable. The team sutured the German first because his abdomen bled in a way that would not wait. They wrapped it. They packed it. "He's prepped next," Edward said to the corporal, breathing the smell of iodine and wool. "Stabilize him and get a blanket on. We'll send him after." "Sir, are you sure?" the corporal gasped. Edward did not answer with words. He kept his eyes on the wound, on the steady, absurd tick of the pocket watch beside the lamp. The decision was a narrow, mechanical thing that drew on memory and muscle more than speech. When the lamp swung low and a gust made the canvas whisper, a lieutenant from the supply tent leaned in, face hollowed by the long day. "There are reports. They want bodies to prove the sweep," the lieutenant said. "High command won't be pleased. We should prioritize our boys." "He's a patient," Edward said. He tied the last knot and wiped his hands clean on a rag. The nurse's armband glinted as she reached for a new bandage. The argument over orders was a white noise under the more immediate noises, groans, the hiss of a respirator, the distant thud of heavy guns. Edward knew officers and men higher up could draw a line and call mercy a trait. He also knew that a man on a table could not read those orders. The surgical lamp made every decision literal. Cut or not cut, clamp or not clamp. Later, when the first stitches held, they moved the German to the ward behind a hanging sheet. He lay with eyes half closed, breathing through cotton that muffled the clink of the watch. The nurse smoothed the blanket, her fingers careful as if smoothing a sheet over something sacred. "Water," he muttered in broken English. "Here," the nurse said, steady. She tipped a cup to his lips and he drank, a small noisy swallow that sounded like apology or relief. She did not ask which. Night bled forward, and the tent took on a hush. The men who could not be saved were wrapped and labeled for the rear. The rest breathed in a line of low lamps like a row of quiet sentries. Edward moved from cot to cot, fingers gloved, checking dressings, pressing on a bandage, listening for a slow, steady breath. He left the pocket watch on the tray beside the German's head. It ticked insistently, a tiny sound inside the room's broader silence. By the second hour, the supply list read like a partial inventory of what war could not replace. 2 ampules of morphine left, 3 antibiotics, a single bottle of ether. Decisions sharpened into necessities. An exhausted medic whispered of a patrol bringing in more wounded with frostbitten fingers and fevered teeth. The nurse rubbed her temples. and tried to count the available stretchers in her head. "How long can we keep him stable?" one orderly asked. "Not long without blood, not long without proper theater," Edward said. He listened to the men breathing. He watched the little watch face as a small, stubborn metronome of past and present. Word traveled in the tent like an echo. A colonel had wired in, blunt and cold, to conserve supplies. There were calls to file reports and to keep a clean record. The men who carried stretchers were tired of carrying symbols and stories. They had seen patients turned away by higher commands before. They feared that a decision to save an enemy officer would bring a reprimand, or worse. "Orders from above. Don't waste ops on enemy officers," the captain relayed, voice low and flat. "He's a patient," Edward said again. His voice had a tired, thin edge now. He could feel the tension of the room as a thing between ribs. The talk hardened into a shape. Some of the orderlies kept their heads low. Others watched the German with a new, bitter eye. A corporal spat by the lamp as if spitting at the idea of sympathy. "Think of London," someone said, an accusation and a plea tangled together. Edward felt the little watch warm under his fingers. The engraving wore smooth from being opened and closed. He let his mind drift to that rainy lecture hall, to the clink of cups in a Berlin cafe, to words exchanged in professional curiosity that had nothing to do with flags. It was a simple, dangerous memory. Later, when the officer stirred and groped blindly, he found the watch and cupped it to his chest. His lips formed a name, Wilhelm, and then a half-formed, unfamiliar word. "Collins?" Edward halted. The room was still, the lamps suddenly louder. The nurse stepped forward and set a hand on the German's forehead. "You knew him?" she asked softly. Edward said nothing. He saw the man in his mind, younger, laughing, eager to talk about suture techniques and the promise of clean operations. The memory did not excuse anything, nor did it make the present easier. It made the choice more personal. A sergeant who had lost his brother in the Blitz walked in and stopped as if struck. He aimed a stare, edged with years of grief at Edward. "Are you saving him because you know him?" the sergeant demanded. Edward answered with a short, horizontal motion of his hand toward the trays and the instruments. "He's a patient." The sergeant's jaw worked. He did not call him a traitor then, but the word hovered like smoke. The nurse looked away, mouth tight. The orderly shifted, suddenly awkward with the sterility of their tools. The room split into small islands of conviction and doubt. The murmur of suspicion followed the watch like a second heartbeat. Someone left a folded ration wrapper by the tray as if to mark a kind of protest. The colonel's message came again, sterner. Rumors of a court inquiry were whispered by men who had little faith left in papers. Edward understood the cost. He also understood what the oath had meant when he first swore it, an old promise inked in a quieter room that had not known the thunder of artillery. He set that promise alongside the thin, bright tick of the watch and chose to keep his hands steady. In the hours that followed, small mercies threaded the tent. The nurse, whose name was Maggie, smoothed the German's hair and tucked a small scrap of paper into the watch lid without telling Edward. It read, "We met in Berlin, remember?" She folded the paper small and slid it in as one might slide a photograph into a locket. "Why?" an orderly asked when he found her later. "Because he asked for water and said my name wrong," she replied. She shrugged. "Because it was raining once, and people were only people." Some of the men watched this and called it folly. Others said nothing. The watch's face caught light and threw it back like a quiet rebuke. In low voices, rumors began to run about the man's rank, about where he had served, about the rubble in London. The tent smelled of petrol and old cloth, but also of boiled tea and antiseptic. Human details refused to be swept away. When the German woke fully, he said very little. His voice was thin and foreign. He looked like a man who had been broken and carefully mended. Edward stood by the cot and watched him form words in a language neither fully shared nor fully alien. "Coffee?" the German asked, because that was the memory he could name. The watch lid had a tiny engraving of a cafe terrace, and the mind often reached for the sentimental in places of danger. Edward found himself smiling without thinking. "No coffee here," he said, "just hot water." The German's mouth quirked. He looked down at the watch in his hand and opened the lid with a slow, wet finger. He saw the small card inside, saw the name scrawled in Maggie's careful hand. He read it and stared at Edward as if watching a photograph come alive. Later that night, under the dim lamp, the corporal Edward had stabilized whispered a complaint. Why him? Why the officer? Edward answered with a simple motion. He handed over a bandage. He steadied a hand. He would not argue the principle again in the space of the ward. It was a debate that would be had among papers and officers. For now, the choice had been made at a table, with a scalpel and a watch and a handful of human memories. The tent kept its watch of its own, men breathing and waiting, the distant guns keeping their terrible schedule. Outside, a stretcher party shouted over the rain. Inside, Edward tied one more knot and licked his fingers. The room smelled faintly of coffee from a thermos someone had left on a crate, and the watch ticked its small, indifferent tick. In the quiet between the shifts, an orderly came back with news. More wounded were on the road, and a patrol almost lost a man to a mine. The list of needs did not shrink. The watch sat by the lamp like an accusation, and like a comfort at once. The choice to operate on Wilhelm Kruger had already radiated small consequences. Some looked at Edward with new distrust. Some offered him a private, quiet thanks when they thought no one watched. The watch collected those small acts, like so many droplets on metal. By dawn, when the first light leaked through the canvas and the smell of wet earth took on a sharper edge, the German was breathing on his own. He turned his head slightly and felt the small paper in his chest pocket. He read the name and made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Edward came to the cot and did not speak. He touched the watch briefly, as if to make sure it was still there, then let his hand rest on the tray for a moment. The nurse caught his eye and nodded once. "You did right," she said softly. He did not say thanks or no. He only moved on to the next cot, the next bandage, the next small life to be nudged back toward staying. The lamp swung. The tent hummed with the low, continuous work of people delaying the end. Outside, a message from a staff car drove up. Orders, stamped and formal, would arrive later. For now, inside that lamped circle, the watch kept its quiet time, and the oath kept its steady pull. The men who had seen the operation would carry that choice with them, like a smell under their clothes, or a bruise that did not hurt but did not disappear. Edward folded the used gauze and placed it in the bin. The pocket watch lay where it had always been during that night, near the lamp, half open, its face catching small shafts of light. It was both a small bridge to a past conference room and an awkward witness to the present. He thought of the men outside the tent, of the ones who would never make it in, of a country house in England burned by bombs, and of a cafe in Berlin. He folded those images together and wrapped them in a quiet that could be carried without words. The oath had been lived, not declared. The watch had been held, not given. The tent kept its steady work, and the choice they had made there would come to mean different things to different people. The tent settled into a slow, hard rhythm of small tasks. Edward made rounds with a metal basin and a notebook, ticking names and wounds as if the act of writing could pin a life down. An ambulance driver handed over a stretcher with frozen fingers. A medic mumbled about losing teeth to the cold on the forward walk. The German officer slept fitfully, the watch warm beneath his palm. Edward paused by a box of ampules and counted them again as if counting might conjure more. "More coming in an hour," a young orderly said, voice thin. "Then we hold what we can," Edward replied, folding gauze. He kept his answers small. The tent did not need argument. It needed steady hands. The nurse, Maggie, moved between beds with the unhurried authority of someone who had seen too many nights. She adjusted a Red Cross armband that had loosened and hummed an old hymn under her breath while she worked the dressing on a French corporal. He watched her fingers, calling out numbers like a prayer: pulse, temperature, capillary refill. The Geneva cross was stitched into her sleeve and into every careful motion. Treat the wounded. That instruction lived in her hands. Outside, a motor car ground up to the ridge, and a staff officer jumped down, mud bright on his boots. He spoke to the lieutenant in clipped sentences about reports and compliance. There was a paper order to move prisoners to a holding camp at first light. Paperwork insisted on clean records and minimal risk. The captain read it and licked the edge, eyes going to the German on the cot. "We'll be noted if we keep him," the captain said, voice dry. "Be ready for questions." "He's a patient," Edward said. He caught the watch with a small protective motion and set it on the tray. The captain's mouth flattened like someone swallowing a hard seed. The tent felt smaller, the lamps closer. An hour later, a corporal from a nearby trench staggered in, cut across the chest and breathing through clenched teeth. He had been hit while dragging a mate from a blasted foxhole. His hand kept fumbling toward a locket he clutched like a talisman. The medic slipped a cannula into a vein. Edward checked its placement and counted time like an instrument. "Will he need theater?" the medic asked. "Yes, but we delay. Finish with what we have here." Edward said, "Keep him warm. If he loses too much, he's gone." The corporal's jaw shifted. He looked at the German across the room and flinched. The room answered with a hush that tasted like ash. War braided names together in strange knots. The corporal's mate on the stretcher outside had been the man who wrote home of gardens and a newly built wall back in England. He had not returned. The nurse placed a hand on the wounded man's shoulder without comment. Small, quiet mercies staved off rancor. In the afternoon, a young lieutenant with a clipboard came in carrying a folded bulletin from headquarters. He read aloud in the lamp's quick light about enemy propaganda using captured officers for staged confessions. The words landed like stones. "This could become farce or fuel," the lieutenant said. "We must ensure no optics give the enemy anything." "Certainly," the captain said. His eyes flicked to Edward. Paper had the power to move men and mute decisions. It could also be a shield for the cautious. Later, a stretcher party arrived with a farmer colonel who had been struck in the thigh by shrapnel. He was lucid and angry about his boots. He demanded a cigarette and muttered about his kennel back home. He found the German watching with an almost curious calm. "You saved a German officer?" the colonel asked, as if tasting the words. "He was near death," Edward answered. "We saved what could be saved." The colonel spat and walked away. Small gestures accumulated like pebbles underfoot. Some slipped into pockets of private approval, others into quiet judgment. The tent kept working, and the watch kept ticking. News moved by rumor and half-sentences. At dusk, a runner came from the rear with a curt message. An inquiry panel had asked for an early list of enemy officers captured in the last sweep. The words "court inquiry" spread fast by lamp and tray. The orderlies looked at Edward with new caution. Some of the men muttered that Mercy would be punished in print. "Do you regret it?" a young orderly asked Edward, voice barely audible. Edward folded a bandage with a slow, precise hand. "Regret won't save anyone," he said. He did not say he had not felt the weight of the watch like a small, cold accusation pressed into his palm. That night, the German spoke in fragments, calling out names and short phrases from a world that seemed small and ordinary compared to the grand war outside the tent. He said Berlin and suture, and once the lecture hall. He kept touching the watch as if to reassure a self that the present had not erased a past. A messenger arrived with orders to transfer prisoner officers at first light. The captain read it by the lamp and chewed the edge of his lip. The order was clear. Keep records tidy. Move prisoners to the designated camp for interrogation and processing. It did not speak of wounds or chances or oaths. It spoke of policy. "We cannot refuse orders," the captain said. He looked to Edward like a man passing a burden he wished were not his. Edward looked at the German and then at the list of names in his notebook. He thought of the lecture hall, the coffee, the easy talk of improving techniques. He thought of bombs over London and of a mother who had lost 2 sons. He thought of the oath he had spoken in a quieter room, with ink still drying on a certificate. He folded his hands briefly, as if to hold those images steady. "We'll comply," he said finally. "But only once he can be moved without a risk of dying on the way." The captain nodded, relief and frustration locked together. The tent became a place of small negotiations, where medical judgment and military directive brushed elbows like strangers crowding a doorway. Dawn came in cold and colorless. Men moved with a slow diligence, clothes pasted with mud and dawn's pale light. The stretcher party to carry prisoners came with half a dozen soldiers whose faces had read too many death notices. They set the German on a cot near the entrance, bundle by bundle, as if he might slip away on the road. "Name?" the lead soldier asked, reading from a ledger. He paused at the name carved inside the watch lid. "Kruger, Wilhelm Kruger," Edward said. The soldier nodded and spat into a puddle. "Keep him moving," he said. His voice held a weariness that did not excuse hardness. The soldiers had left families and houses, and now always carried the weight of those abandoned things. A news sheet had a different effect than a court order. Word that a German officer had been spared by a British surgeon had already reached the trenches via letters and cigarettes and small, bitter jokes. That morning, a corporal from a nearby unit came in to see with his own eyes. "You kept him? For what?" the corporal demanded. "For medicine," Edward said. "For the chance he had." The corporal's eyes flashed. "We lost lads in the Blitz," he said. "You'd save one of theirs?" Edward's hands were steady as he wrapped a new dressing. "He's a patient," he said. The phrase was measured. spare. It was also a shield and a confession. The corporal left without another word, but with a hardness that was visible as a new line drawn in the group. Men had long memories. Decisions made in a tent could echo back in a foxhole. The watch remained a tiny, private witness on the tray. On the second day, the German asked for a pencil and began to draw in a battered notebook someone had given him. He sketched a street scene, tables, and a small awning. He drew a cup on a saucer and the shape of a teacup handle. The act was small and human, and it made the nurse laugh quietly. She slipped him a crust of bread and a half portion of stew without asking. "Do you think he will be taken?" she asked Edward one quiet moment near the wash basin. "He will be, if he is well enough," Edward said. He had the report lodged in his pocket like a stone. "We will do what we can medically." "You did more than that last night," she said. Her eyes were plain and tired. "You gave him time." He heard the plainness of her praise and felt a small, fierce relief that did not erase the worry of orders and papers. The tent contained both duty and private grace, stitched together in ways that official lines could not always measure. A midday alarm sent everyone into a practiced shuffle. Shelling drew close, and for a tense hour the tent shuddered. Men clutched at the cots, and a boy from the supply detail buried his face in his hands and sobbed softly when a crate fell and broke. The German reached across the blanket and touched the boy's wrist, a brief, clumsy gesture of comfort that looked both absurd and necessary. "Quiet," an officer hissed at the boy. "Keep your head down." The German's mouth, when he spoke, was soft. "Peace," he said in halting English. It was not a political act, it was a human one. The boy looked up and, for a second, the armor of anger dropped from his face. The tent swallowed the small kindness and kept beating. By afternoon, the transfer trucks were reported delayed. Weather and mud had rerouted convoys, red tape clotted progress. The delay felt like a reprieve. Men in the tent moved more easily, as if time had hollowed for them a breathing space. Edward used the time to check wounds again, to change bandages, to reposition a mattress seam to spare a pressure sore. Later that day, a man from the quartermaster's tent arrived with a tin of tea and a pair of dry socks for the wounded. He had been in the same village as someone who had been shelled. He carried a small, private rage that flared when he saw German buttons on a coat. He spat on the ground, and then, after a long silence, left the tea beside the German's tray. "Leave it," Maggie said to him. "He may be an enemy now, but he is also cold." The quartermaster stared and then turned away without answering. People in a war were habitually split between acts of cruelty and actions of mercy. The tent collected both like winter collects rain. That evening, a corporal came in bearing news of a fallen friend whose dog tags had been recovered. The man had been a quiet presence in the mess hall, always asking about the weather at home. He had been the kind of person whose absence was heavy. The corporal crumpled when he heard the news, and some of the men blamed the decision to save an enemy for distracting the team from other patients. "You took time we could not spare," he said to Edward, voice breaking. "That's why he died." "It is not that simple," Edward said. He could have pointed to wounds, to seconds and decisions, to the cold arithmetic of triage. He did not. He replaced a bandage and walked to the next cot. A thin line of grief threaded the tent. Some blamed, some mourned in silence. The watch ticked on. Another night, a staff car arrived with an inspector from Divisional HQ. He wanted a full account. He wanted to know why a German officer had been kept beyond the first round of triage. He wanted paperwork and reasons that fit a ledger. Edward wrote an account in blunt sentences, times of admission, procedures done, a note that transfer was ordered once stable. The inspector read it and nodded, expression unreadable. "You followed medical judgment," the inspector said finally. "But we must be careful about perceptions." Perceptions had teeth. They could bite careers and reputations in half. Edward felt an old weariness settle in him like a bandage, the knowledge that doing what was right could be messy on paper. When the inspector left, the tent felt like the inside of a held breath. The nurse refilled a basin and dried her hands on a rag. The orderly arranged tray instruments as if forming a little ritual. The watch, which had been open and obvious for 2 days, was now carefully closed and tucked beside the German's pillow like a quiet soldier. A mid-morning rumor told of an enemy field hospital taken farther north where doctors had been executed. The tent went very still, and men spoke in lower voices. The Geneva Convention had been a piece of paper with big words. The tent was the place where its promise was tested. The idea that a man in a hospital might be harmed despite the cross sewn on cloth sent chills through them. Edward caught the look in Maggie's eyes. They spoke without words. The oath had to be upheld, not only to protect enemies, but to protect the sanctity of healing itself. If hospitals became killing grounds, there was no refuge left. A week into the slow swing of days and small mercies, a transfer order finally came through with vehicles and men assigned. The Germans' wounds were healed enough for travel, but still tender. Edward wrote a final note on the chart. "Stable for transfer. Watch in place. Please treat with care." He signed it and folded it into a small packet. "Take care of his watch," the nurse whispered as the stretcher party arrived. Edward handed the pocket watch to the orderly who would travel with the prisoners. A small trust passed across a muddy palm. "Keep it safe," he said. The orderly nodded, unaware of the weight the metal might carry in the days to come. As they loaded stretchers onto the truck, the German looked at Edward and managed a small, weary smile. He extended his hand, and Edward took it. The touch was quick and spare, and did not contain absolution for much. It contained simply 2 men acknowledging a shared, difficult truth. "Thank you," the German said in broken English. Edward did not say he had risked a reprimand or that he had kept a memory alive. He only tightened his grip and let go. The truck rolled away through the mud and the rain. The watch was tucked into a blanket, the engraving of the cafe hidden for now. In the tent, the space that had held arguments and stitches felt different, lighter in some places, rawer in others. Men folded up cots and packed away instruments, moving with the automatic grace of those who had rehearsed survival. The decision they had made lingered in small gestures. The nurse's paper tucked into a watch lid, a bandage folded twice instead of 3 times, a cup left on a tray. Later that evening, as the lamp burned low and the men settled into a tired quiet, the lieutenant who had worried about optics came to Edward's cot with a small, furtive nod. "You did what you thought right," he said. "I only hope it stays right in the books." "Time will tell," Edward replied. He let his hand rest on his notebook for a moment before closing his eyes. The watch's absence was a hollow at the edge of his thoughts, and the memory of its small tick remained like an afterimage. Outside, The guns still set their distant, relentless beat. Inside, the tent held the quiet footfalls of men doing their work. The choice to save a man whose name had once been scribbled in a different time had altered the course of a few small lives. The oath had been kept in the narrow, literal way physicians keep promises, by action, not proclamation. The ripple of that action would meet orders, rumors, and the slow machinery of war in ways that could not all be foreseen.